Prior to this appointment, Essoka held the position of CEO at Standard Chartered Bank Central and West Africa. This is Captains of Industry. You're watching Captains of Industry here on CNBC Africa. We're speaking to Ebenezer Essoka. He's the CEO of Standard Chartered Bank South Africa. Ebenezer, thank you very much for your time. Let's kick off with your early days and when you initially entered the banking foray. I believe that was with the Boston Bank in the United States. Take us back to that time.
Well, Bank of Boston came rounded as an accident because my original career objectives was to be a diplomat. But I got depressed when I watched various sessions at the United Nations take the world nowhere. And on the other hand, being in New York, I watched the Wall Street transform experiences. That got me interested in banking. And thus, my journey with Bank of Boston.
And then your foray onto the African continent with the Boston Bank of Cameroon. That must have been an interesting transition from the US to the continent and specifically into Cameroon.
Actually, before Cameroon, I had a spiel in South America with Bank of Boston and also with France with Bank of Boston. And I had this unique opportunity I believe any African in his mid-20s would dream to have. Be transferred to your home country as an expatriate by an international company. That's what took me to Cameroon, to Bank of Boston. And from there, I never turned back. I decided this was the place to be.
What attracted you to Standard Chartered Bank? 1986, if my memory serves me correct, was when you made the move to Standard Chartered Bank. And 1993, very quickly you fast-tracked to the first African CEO for a bank that had been some 135 years on the African continent.
It was very simple. By the time I moved to Cameroon with Bank of Boston, I realized Cameroon was too small. And at 25, there is no way I was going to retire in Cameroon, and then looked for a company that will enable me play in the continent of Africa, because I consider the continent then as a playground for me. And Standard Chartered Bank had a footprint that was the most attractive at the time, and I must say remains the most attractive today in the continent of Africa. And that's why I joined Standard Chartered.
Coming back to the fact that Standard Chartered has operated on the continent for 135 years, why did they choose you as their first African CEO of a Standard Chartered Bank subsidiary?
I guess I was unorthodox, and I challenged status quo. I demanded the right to operate and compete on the basis of merit, and I felt I could earn my keep across the continent as an expatriate of Standard Chartered.
What did your position do then for transformation within the Standard Chartered banking group?
I think I was a myth buster. The fact that people thought an African couldn't run a business within the continent was changed when I was the first chief executive to become an active member of the management team of Standard Chartered. And as such, inspired confidence in others to seek similar opportunities across the space. And it went beyond me as an individual to the whole conversation about the diversity and inclusion mix of Standard Chartered Bank. And many other minority groups were inspired to do different things. And today, if you look at the mix of Standard Chartered, we are operating in approximately 71 countries, 125 nationalities, and we have chief executives, representatives of these broad-based national backgrounds that you have at Standard Chartered Bank.
November 2008, you were appointed as CEO of Standard Chartered Bank South Africa. What are you planning to do in your position, considering you've only been there for around about one and a half years almost?
Well, I'm not new to South Africa because all along I've been a member for over 12 years, actually more than 15 years, of the African management team. So I've always mirrored what has been going on in South Africa, and I've made decisions that have affected our businesses in South Africa. So it's not new space, it's familiar space. Clearly, ambition here is to ensure that South Africa increasingly becomes much more competitive globally. Because if we look at our footprint, we're very strong in Asia, Middle East, and Africa. And South African corporates today need markets in all these areas. The net effect would be to create jobs in South Africa, improve the productivity of industries in South Africa, and as such, assist the government realize more tax revenues that will help them with the social stress they face in health, education, security.
We've seen a very interesting time in both the economic environment and the equity market, just to cite the fact that in March 2008 we were hitting all-time highs across equity markets globally and of course also in South Africa. And then came March 2009 and we hit lows across all equity markets. It's been a very, very topsy-turvy environment and a difficult environment for business leaders to negotiate. How have you found the last 2 years?
We've been privileged to find ourselves emerging from this crisis. If I use an analogy of Formula One experience, we find ourselves emerging in a pole position. So we have performed and outperformed competitors across the space and feel very privileged because we're emerging with a stronger balance sheet, which is well capitalized, strong liquidity positions, and a solid customer base. So our real issue today is not what happened in the past, but where we take the bank going forward.
But you've got to look at the global environment, and the big debate at the moment is whether we could potentially see a double-dip recession on the horizon. We've got the sovereign risk issue that has now come to the fore. Fiscal deficits are certainly the order of the day. Do you cast your eye over the global arena and perhaps have one or two sleepless nights about where potentially we are going from here?
Sleepless nights, no. Because we pride ourselves in saying we will never be complacent. So what we do is we gather the right intelligence to ensure that we're well positioned to deal with these issues. So the global challenges, what are they? If you ask me what they are, I'll tell you. What I see is imbalances globally. I see an issue of us not being able to manage the recovery successfully. I see an issue of having the unintended consequences of regulatory requirements. And I see ourselves being positioned, if we're not very careful, in space that would make it very difficult for the key stakeholders involved, both in the public and private sector, to have appropriate conversations that would lead to the desired equilibrium in opinions and those the right actions to address the issues of recovery, job creation in this context.
Reading between the lines of what you're saying, I get the impression that you're relatively cautious on the global recovery and the traction that we're seeing at present. Would that be fair?
Naturally. You've got to be cautious, but you've got to be confident. By nature, I'm optimistic, and I maintain an optimistic bias.
Do you think that the global picture is going to be completely different in 5 years? So many out there say that this is the time of the Asian giants, that the developed economies as we know them, the United States and the United Kingdom, are going to fall behind the likes of China and India.
Well, maybe not fall behind, but in a different competitive space. We foresaw this and took positions much earlier than anybody else. Between the late 70s and 80s, and obviously early 90s, we defined our strategic intent to focus on Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. We did anticipate a shift to the East, and we got ourselves well positioned in these markets. I think because of this, today, we are very familiar with developments in these markets and do believe the great opportunities in these markets, exciting markets. And if you execute with discipline and the right focus, and of course, with the right customer base, you're likely to succeed.
Do you believe in the China growth story? Some 10% per annum in terms of GDP growth. Is that firmly intact for you?
I think it would be unrealistic not to recognize China as a major force. And yes, do I believe in this story? I've been to China. And over the past 10 years, I've spent approximately, on an annual basis, at least a month in China. So yes, I do not only believe in the China story, I have real practical examples of how the China story has worked in China and also across the world.
Coming back to the Standard Chartered Bank, how does Standard Chartered Bank South Africa fit into the global banking giant?
I think it's at the center of a value proposition in Africa. I think what we are trying to do in South Africa is to get South Africans to believe that they can really transform this space to be the linchpin into sub-Saharan Africa, and at the same time make it sufficiently attractive for capital and investment flows into South Africa. So what we do when we sell South Africa, we don't just sell the domestic value proposition within South Africa, but we sell a sub-Saharan African market space, which I think if South Africa takes advantage of the inefficiencies that are north of the Limpopo, South African corporates will be extremely well positioned. So for us, in Standard Chartered Bank, South Africa is at the center of a value proposition.
Ebenezer, prior to your becoming CEO of Standard Chartered Bank South Africa, you were CEO of Standard Chartered Bank Central and Western Africa. How's your role changed now from what it was then?
First of all, less traveling, because I covered a wide variety of countries, from Senegal to Gabon, Anglophone, Francophone. So I don't speak as much French today as I spoke then. But then I think what we found as a missing link was our inability to leverage scale in South Africa. So today, my objective, although much more focused on a given geography, are much more ambitious. We have great plans for South Africa, keeps me absolutely busy. And if you look at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange and look at the market capitalization of the top 10 companies, you would understand the reason for us being here and the scale and the intention we have for this market.
I still want to draw on your experience on the African continent and the fact that you have traveled extensively across the continent, so you are very aware of the problems that perhaps do plague the African continent. What would you say is the biggest challenge to Africa one day speaking with one voice?
I think a reconciliation of the views of the various leaders across the geographies. You find different positions taken by different leaders, and Africa has been unable to articulate a united position when dealing with key corporates across the world or dealing with politicians in other key markets. So I think until Africa can come together and realize there is value in working in concert across geographies to realize ambitions of various countries, you will never have the scale that will give you that importance and give you a voice around the table.